I will tell you tonight about a bridge that was not merely stone over water, but a path where people walked and then vanished. A bridge built to protect a growing city, yet slowly it became a place of whispers, fear, and disappearance. Why did people cross it and never reach the other side? Where did they go? And was it truly the bridge that swallowed them, or was the river waiting patiently below? What were those violent currents that smashed boats into stone? Why did the arches turn the Thames into a deadly trap few survived? Who were the thieves who hid in the shadows? How did some people fall silently into the darkness without anyone seeing? Why were the severed heads of criminals placed above its gates? And why did crossing under them feel like walking between life and death? What happened during the great fires that burned the houses built on the bridge? Why did every attempt to repair it only increase the fear? How did real accidents become legends? And who first called it the bridge that eats people? What did historians find centuries later, when they opened the archives and read the forgotten records? Was the bridge truly cursed? Or was it only a reflection of how dangerous medieval life really was? London Bridge. Welcome to Sleeping Radio. Tonight we travel to an old city where a bridge was built for safety and trade and slowly became a place of fear and disappearance. Many people crossed it every day under the sky of London, yet some never reached the other side, and their names faded like footsteps in the fog. This is the story of London Bridge, the bridge that ate people, the bridge where the river whispered secrets, and where history mixed with danger. Over centuries, the stones watched kings, merchants, criminals, pilgrims, and children, and the waters below carried both boats and bodies. Long before the frightening legends began, there was only the river Thames flowing quietly and slowly, dividing the city into two growing worlds. People crossed by boats, waiting for the tides, praying the river would be kind. But London grew larger, markets became busy, and trade expanded, and the people demanded something permanent. A bridge felt like progress, a promise that life would become easier. The first wooden bridge stood in the 12th century, built with hope and faith, but it was weak and often damaged. Fires, storms, and floods kept breaking it, and every time people rebuilt it with trembling hands. In the year 1176, work began on a stronger stone bridge under King Henry II, and it was finally completed in the early 13th century. The architect Peter of Colchurch designed it like a fortress, heavy and powerful, resting on 19 massive arches. The bridge soon turned into a living street above the river, with houses, shops, and even a chapel standing in the middle. People bought bread, fish, cloth, and candles while the river rushed beneath their feet like a restless ghost. Children played, merchants argued, and travelers crossed, feeling the bridge shake as carts and horses moved across the narrow path. It was crowded, noisy, and full of life. But beneath this busy world there was something darker happening, something the people whispered about only at night. The water under the bridge did not move gently. It turned wild and violent because of the tight arches that forced the river through narrow openings. This created deadly whirlpools and violent currents, and boats often crashed into the supports and broke apart. Many men drowned, and bodies were found days later, drifting silently to the banks. Soon Londoners began to call the currents shooting the bridge as the deadly dive. Sailors feared it, and some made the sign of the cross before passing, hoping the river would let them live. And slowly the idea grew that the bridge had a hunger, that it swallowed people when nobody watched. As centuries passed, Houses leaned over the water, wood rotted, floors creaked, and cracks appeared. Parts of the bridge were dark even during the day because tall buildings blocked the sunlight. Thieves used these shadows as hiding places, and stories spread about men who stepped into a quiet corner and never returned. There were robberies, kidnappings, and murders recorded in the city archives. London at night could be cruel, and the bridge was one of its most dangerous places. Sometimes bodies were recovered downstream, marked by wounds and bruises, leading people to believe there were gangs who worked only near the bridge, waiting for their victims. In some periods, heads of executed criminals were placed on spikes above the gates at the entrance of the bridge. Travelers saw them as they crossed, their eyes staring toward the water, warning everyone of power and punishment. The sight was terrifying, and it added to the feeling that the bridge was cursed, guarded by death itself, and never fully safe. During storms, people slipped, railings broke, carts overturned, and frightened horses dragged their riders into the water. There were no modern safety rules, no lights strong enough to guide travelers at night. The bridge became narrow, crowded, and dangerous, especially in winter rains when stones became slippery like ice. Documents from medieval London describe accidents, drownings, and mysterious disappearances. Chroniclers wrote about floods that destroyed parts of the bridge in 1381 and later in 1561. Engineers repaired and rebuilt again, yet every disaster deepened the fear that the bridge was somehow alive and cruel. Parents warned their children not to walk alone on it at night. Sailors said the river beneath it carried more bones than any other place in London. Visitors told stories when they returned home about the city with the bridge that eats people. But the truth is more complex, and history explains the fear. London Bridge was not a monster. It was a dangerous combination of architecture, poverty, crime, and uncontrolled nature. The tight arches trapped water, the narrow path trapped people, and the hidden corners offered shadows for criminals to hide in. Over time, legends grew, and each generation added something darker. Some said there were secret doors that opened and dropped people into the water. Others imagined tunnels for thieves and killers that could not be found. But historical research shows most disappearances were accidents, robberies gone wrong, or drownings caused by the powerful current. Still, fear does not always listen to reason. When darkness falls and the wind blows across the Thames, the bridge seems to whisper stories, and people remember every tragedy ever told there. London Bridge became not only a structure, but a symbol, a reminder that progress always comes with risk, and every city carries ghosts. To understand the truth behind the legend, historians turn to city records, diaries, court documents, and engineering reports. They studied how the shape of the medieval bridge forced the Thames to rush like a trapped beast beneath the arches. They found detailed notes describing how boats smashed against the stone piers, and how even experienced sailors feared the passage during low tide. The bridge had become both a road and a dangerous dam that twisted the water with brutal force. Writers from the 13th and 14th centuries mentioned repeated drownings. Chronicles spoke about people falling during storms, slipping on wet stones, and being swept away before anyone could reach them. Others described travelers robbed at night, pushed, beaten, and left to vanish into the darkness, while the current carried their bodies away. One of the most famous accidents came in the winter of 1399, when heavy ice moved down the Thames. Large frozen sheets crashed against the bridge, and destroyed boats waiting below. Many people died, and rumors spread that the bridge demanded sacrifice because it had stood for so long that it needed lives to survive. Another disaster struck in 1517 when a fire broke out again among the wooden houses. Flames ran across rooftops while frightened residents tried to escape, carrying children and belongings across narrow passages. Some fell in the panic, and the stories of the bridge eating people only grew stronger. Modern researchers such as David Harrison and historians of medieval London have written about these events, using surviving documents from the London Bridge Ward and City archives. They explain that fear turned into legend because life on the bridge mixed danger with daily routine. Imagine sleeping above a wild river, hearing the sound of water hitting stone every night, and knowing that one mistake could pull you into the dark. Engineers also studied the strange phenomenon called shooting the bridge. Boats that passed through the narrow openings were often thrown forward at terrifying speed. Many passengers knelt and prayed as they crossed, because a single wrong movement meant the boat would overturn and sink within seconds. Travelers from Europe wrote about London Bridge in their journals during the 16th and 17th centuries. They described it as beautiful and terrifying at the same time, a marketplace floating above a deadly river. Some praised the view of the city, while others left with haunted memories of accidents they had witnessed. By the 19th century, newspapers began to record events with greater detail, and we can read about drownings, suicides, and crimes near the bridge with more accuracy. The story of a man rescued after being swept under the arches and pulled out downstream shocked readers. People felt that the old legends might still hold a piece of truth hidden beneath the surface. Yet with each new bridge, the city tried to reduce the danger. Wider paths, stronger railings, better lighting, and more careful design slowly changed the experience of crossing the Thames. But the name London Bridge continued to carry centuries of fear, whispered stories, and the memory of those who never reached the other side. Today, visitors walk across the modern bridge without thinking about whirlpools or collapsing houses. Cars move smoothly, tourists take photos, and the river flows calmly as if nothing bad ever happened here. But underneath, the history remains like layers of forgotten dreams resting on the water. As the legend of the bridge that ate people spread across generations, it became part of London's identity. Parents told the story in soft voices to warn children to be careful whenever they crossed the river. Sailors repeated the tales in taverns at night, adding new details and fears, until the bridge seemed like a living creature that waited patiently for mistakes. Over time, no one could separate history from imagination, because both flowed together like water through the arches. Historians today remind us that medieval cities were harsh places, full of danger, illness, and crime. A crowded bridge built with narrow paths and heavy structures simply amplified those risks. The stones were cold, the railings were weak, and the river beneath had a strength that humans could not control. Life was fragile, and the Thames often reminded people of that truth. When we look back at the dates, we can see how slowly the story formed over centuries. From the building of the stone bridge around the early 1300s, through fires in 1573, and disasters like ice-breaking in 1399, fear kept returning again and again. Then the Great Fire of 1666, then repairs in the 1700s, then the final replacement in 1831. Each era added another layer to the myth. The bridge did not eat people on purpose, but tragedy repeated so often that imagination created a darker explanation. Researchers studying the London Bridge archives described letters from families searching for missing relatives. Some disappeared during storms, others after robberies, and many after falling into the violent currents. Their grief shaped the legend more than anything else, because a story is born wherever pain cannot fully be explained. When the 19th century bridge was moved to America, many people wondered why anyone would want such a haunted name. Yet in Arizona, it became a curiosity, a reminder of old history standing under a different sky. Visitors walk across it in the desert sun and think about the fog of London and about the countless souls who once crossed with fear in their hearts. On the modern London Bridge, life continues in quiet order. Buses pass, shoes tap the pavement, and the city glows around it like a restless sea of lights. Most people never imagine the houses that once leaned over the water, the spikes that once carried heads, or the boats that fought against death beneath the arches. But if someone stops at night and listens carefully, they may feel a faint echo rising from the river. It is the echo of centuries, the memory of danger, and the whisper of a bridge that witnessed more than any street should ever see. In truth, the story of the bridge that ate people reminds us about human fear, about fragile engineering, and about how legends grow from real sorrow. Facts tell us that accidents, crime, and powerful currents created the tragedies, yet our minds still build shadows around them. And so the legend survives, not because the bridge was alive, but because memory is alive and it refuses to forget those who vanished into the dark water. When historians read old tax records, they discovered how people actually lived on the bridge, paying rent for rooms hanging above the moving water. The houses were packed so closely together that many rooms barely saw sunlight. Children played on balconies built from weak wood, while merchants shouted prices through narrow windows overlooking the street. One wrong step meant falling into chaos below where carts, horses, and rushing crowds collided. Travelers wrote that the bridge sometimes smelled like smoke, fish, animals, and damp stone all at once. Life there was loud and restless, and the river added its own constant roar. Engineers from later centuries were shocked when they studied drawings of the medieval structure. They realized that each pier squeezed the water tighter until it turned wild and violent as it passed through. Sailors described how boats would rise suddenly like tossed leaves and then drop again with terrifying force. Many passengers fainted while others clung to anything they could reach. Some ferrymen even refused to pass under certain arches, choosing longer routes instead, because they believed certain spots brought only death. Those stories slowly became part of the legend and shaped the way people looked at the bridge. Court documents recorded fines for fighting, robbery, and attacks on the bridge during busy market days. Judges wrote about bodies discovered days later, recovered far downstream and recognized only by clothing. Rumors began to spread that there were hidden doors in shops where criminals dragged victims before throwing them to the river. Fear grew faster than truth, because fear travels easily from one mouth to another. Writers in later centuries repeated these tales again and again, polishing them until they sounded like dark poetry. The bridge turned into a stage where every tragedy seemed possible. Meanwhile, real life continued on top of it. Families praying, merchants working, guards watching, and the river endlessly moving below. Every day mixed normal life with a constant threat of danger. When the old bridge was finally taken apart, workers found damaged stones, rotten beams, and hidden spaces nobody had noticed for years. These discoveries made people believe even more that secrets had been buried inside its walls. The new bridges that followed were wider, safer, and built with lessons learned from the past. Still, people standing there could not forget the shadow of history that seemed to linger over the Thames. Researchers keep returning to the archives, to the letters, to the maps, and to the diaries that survived. Each document reveals another small piece of life on the bridge, and another reason why fear became so powerful. Some researchers focus on the economic power of the bridge. Because it was more than stone, it was a marketplace that fed the city. Every stall and every shop depended on the endless stream of travelers passing over the Thames. Money flowed across it just as strongly as the river below, and wherever there is money, there is jealousy, crime, and risk. The legend of danger grew alongside the wealth. Doctors of the time wrote about the diseases that spread easily in crowded places, especially where moisture and dirt collected. Many illnesses began on the bridge and spread to the rest of the city like an invisible tide. People whispered that the bridge punished them, but in truth it was poor hygiene, ignorance, and crowded living conditions that created so much suffering. The structure simply carried the weight of human life. At night, torches flickered along the narrow path, casting long, uneven shadows on the stones. Travelers moved carefully, listening to footsteps behind them and the deep echo of the river below. Some nights fog rolled in thick and heavy so that people could not even see the other side. In that darkness, every sound felt like a threat, and every step like a risk. Sailors learned to judge the tides by listening rather than looking, hearing the rhythm of the water as it struck the piers. They knew that one wrong moment meant being dragged under the arches and spun helplessly. Families who lived nearby often woke to the cries of someone falling or a boat breaking apart. The river carried those sounds like distant memories drifting across the city. Writers centuries later tried to understand why this one bridge created such powerful stories. They realized it combined every fear people had about nature, height, darkness, strangers, and death. It became a symbol that gathered all those fears into one place where everyone had to pass, whether they wanted to or not. Crossing it meant facing both the river and the unknown. Gradually, records began to show plans for better safety and new engineering ideas. Officials debated removing the houses, widening the passage, and changing the arches so the water could move more freely. But every change cost money and disrupted business, so decisions came slowly while danger continued. People lived between progress and risk for generations. Archaeologists today study the remains of old foundations still resting beneath the modern river. They find tools, broken pottery, iron fragments, and traces of daily life that once filled the bridge with noise. Each discovery reminds us that the legend grew from real people and real events, not from imagination alone. The bridge absorbed their stories the way the river absorbs rain. City engineers in later centuries tried to calculate how many people might have died near the bridge, but records were incomplete and often lost. Many accidents were never written down, especially when they involved the poor or strangers passing through. This uncertainty helped the legend grow because no one could say exactly how many disappeared. The unknown always invites imagination to fill the silence. Travelers arriving from distant countries heard stories before ever seeing the bridge. By the time they stood on its stones, they already felt the weight of fear pressing quietly on their thoughts. Some described the first step as entering a narrow world suspended above danger, where every creak and every shout sounded louder than usual. The bridge shaped the way they felt about London itself. In the archives there are letters from merchants complaining about theft and violence along the busy stalls. They begged city officials for more guards and stricter rules, yet the crowds kept growing faster than any solution. Life moved too quickly for order, and chaos became part of the rhythm of the place. People simply learned to live with risk, as if it were weather. Stories of bodies washing ashore days later continued to spread across neighborhoods. Families whispered names at night, wondering how someone could cross a bridge and never arrive. These stories traveled from house to house, from generation to generation, until they became woven into the memory of the city. The bridge had become a silent witness that no one could ignore. When artists painted the river, they often included the bridge as a dark silhouette rising against the sky. It stood not only as architecture but as a symbol of danger and survival. Poets described the Thames as a restless throat, swallowing everything that fell into it. The idea of the bridge eating people felt natural in such a world. Teachers told students about the engineering mistakes and the historical disasters. Yet after the lessons ended, the children still preferred the darker stories because they sounded mysterious and alive. Human beings are drawn to legends that mix truth with fear, and London Bridge offered the perfect place for such stories to grow. Each passing century added another voice to the whisper. In the modern age, researchers visit museums and libraries to read fragile manuscripts and old maps. They trace the lines of the river and the positions of the arches, imagining what it felt like to stand there centuries ago. They see how narrow the paths were and how close the houses leaned toward the water. They realize that people walked daily along edges that today would be considered too dangerous to approach. Modern writers sometimes visit the bridge at night and try to sense the past through the sound of the water. They stand quietly and imagine horses, carts, shouts, and footsteps layered across time. The river seems gentle today, but it still carries the same deep strength it always had. Beneath the lights of the city, it moves with patience, as if remembering everything it once received. Some historians argue that the legend of the bridge that ate people is really a story about cities themselves. Whenever humans build something huge and powerful, they also create unexpected dangers. London Bridge simply revealed how fragile life can be when people live close together over nature they cannot fully control. It turned ordinary fear into something larger and more poetic. Travel diaries from the past reveal small moments that never made it into official records. A lost shoe, a broken cartwheel, a frightened child clinging to a parent while the path shook beneath them. Each of these moments added invisible bricks to the legend. Over centuries they built a tower of memory taller than the bridge itself. Engineers who study disasters say that legends often rise where risk was constant and explanations were few. People needed stories to make sense of sudden tragedy, so they imagined secret passages, hidden traps, and criminals working in shadows that no one could see. The myth became a shield against confusion. At the same time, there were acts of courage that rarely get told. Sailors who risked their lives to save others, and strangers reaching out hands in storms to pull someone back from the edge. These quiet acts disappeared into history, while the darker tales remained. Fear always echoes louder than kindness. Museums in London today preserve fragments of the old bridge. Pieces of worn stone show grooves cut by centuries of carts and feet. When visitors look at them, they realize how many lives passed across that narrow path. Each scratch in the stone feels like a whisper from the past. Researchers continue to compare documents, reconstruct maps, and build models to understand how the bridge truly worked. Their studies show clearly that design, current, and overcrowding created most of the danger. Yet even after all this knowledge, the legend still survives in stories, books, and quiet conversations. It has become part of how the city sees itself, layered like fog over the river. In the research of David Harrison about the history of the bridge, he explains how city accounts recorded repeated repairs after fires and floods. These city accounts show that damage was constant and danger was always present. Peter Ackroyd, in his book London Bridge, the biography describes how people lived above the water in fragile wooden houses. He writes about the fear of night crossings when the only light came from weak torches along the path. Patricia Pierce studied old drawings and documents that showed the arches pressing the river into violent channels. Her work explains why many boats overturned when they tried to pass beneath the bridge at the wrong time of tide. City records collected in the Annals of London tell of fires in the 1500s and 1600s that destroyed whole sections. The panic, the crowding, and the narrow escape routes turned accidents into disasters. Chronicles mentioned in medieval London by Ralph Flenley speak of bodies found far downstream after storms. Families recognized the clothing, but did not always know how or when the fall had happened. In the writings about the Thames by Peter Ackroyd, the river is described as powerful and unpredictable, able to punish mistakes without mercy. When that force met the stone piers of the bridge, the result became deadly. Legal documents preserved by London authorities show fines, theft cases, and violent assaults taking place on the bridge. These documents reveal that crime was not legend but daily reality in a crowded market world. Archaeologists mentioned in the story of London Bridge uncovered stones scarred by centuries of cartwheels. Those scars are silent proof that the bridge carried more weight and traffic than it was ever meant to hold. Reports in the 19th century newspapers collected by historians speak of suicides and attempted rescues near the arches. The public read these accounts, and the legend continued to grow alongside the truth. H.M. Colvin, in the History of the King's Works, describes how royal authorities struggled to pay for rebuilding and reinforcement. Money shortages meant repairs were delayed and danger remained for generations. When Patricia Pierce writes about the heads of executed criminals placed above the entrance, she shows how fear became part of the crossing itself. Travelers passed beneath death before facing the roar of the river. Historians studying the London Bridge Ward archives discovered lists of rents paid by people living above the river. These lists prove that whole families slept over water that could swallow them in one mistake. Maps reproduced in several historical works show how the arches narrowed the current. Modern engineers looking at those maps understand clearly why sailors said shooting the bridge was like gambling with life. In the records summarized by John Richardson in the Annals of London, there is mention of the flood of 1381, damaging parts of the bridge. Workers labored for months while people still had to cross every day above broken stones and unstable supports. Peter Ackroyd describes how during the early 1500s merchants complained that carts often got stuck for hours. This created stampedes and quarrels, and sometimes people were pushed so hard that they fell over the edges. In the accounts preserved by the bridge ward officials, there are lines about constant maintenance on chains, gates, and piers. These simple entries reveal how fragile the structure truly was despite its massive appearance. David Harrison explains that even the chapel built on the bridge became unsafe after several fires. Worshippers prayed surrounded by cracked walls and hanging beams that threatened to fall at any time. Medieval travelers writing in chronicles cited by Ralph Flenley spoke of the terrible noise of the water striking the piers. They said the sound alone made people afraid before they even began to cross. Patricia Pierce notes that children sometimes worked on the bridge carrying goods for shopkeepers. Their small bodies moved among carts, horses, and rushing people, where one slip could mean disappearance forever. In the city court rolls, historians found cases where bodies were recovered and questions were asked about robbery. Many cases stayed unresolved because witnesses vanished and the river had already erased the traces. Peter Ackroyd tells of the frost-fair years when the Thames froze and people walked across the ice. When the thaw came, pieces of ice crashed into the bridge and destroyed boats waiting beneath it. Newspaper compilations from the 19th century show readers writing letters about dangerous tides near the arches. Even after improvements, the reputation of the place still carried fear from older times. H.M. Colvin describes repair projects ordered by kings and councils, yet often delayed by politics and cost. While arguments continued, ordinary citizens kept crossing the same risky path day after day. In the archaeological notes mentioned by David Harrison, fragments of tools and household items were found near the foundations. They likely fell from the houses above, reminders that people lived daily life over deep moving water. The diaries of visitors quoted by several historians describe walking between tall, leaning houses that blocked the light. They felt as if they were inside a tunnel while the river roared somewhere below their feet. Jerry White, in his Social History of London, explains how poverty drove many desperate people to the bridge seeking work or shelter. Crowded misery and constant movement created the perfect place for tragedy to repeat. In the bridge accounts studied by Peter Ackroyd, there are notes about toll collectors arguing with travelers. Such disputes sometimes turned violent when tempers mixed with fear and crowding. David Harrison points out that several sections had to be rebuilt after parts of the structure sagged under the enormous weight of houses and shops. The bridge was never designed to carry a whole neighborhood above a river. Ralph Flenley mentions reports of storms where carts slid across wet stones and struck pedestrians. The combination of narrow space and panic made rescue almost impossible. In Patricia Pierce's research on old drawings, she highlights ladders hanging over the sides for workers. If someone slipped near them, they might disappear into the water before anyone noticed. City records gathered by John Richardson list sudden fires caused by cooking or candles inside shops. Flames spread quickly along wooden beams, while people shouted and tried to escape toward the gates. Newspaper archives later retold these disasters and added emotion that kept the legend alive. Readers imagined the bridge as a place where fate waited quietly. H.M. Colvin shows how engineers repeatedly warned authorities about structural strain. Their warnings were often ignored because business on the bridge brought steady income. In the social history written by Jerry White, there are scenes of beggars sleeping near shop doors. Hunger and desperation pushed some into dangerous corners where a single push could end a life. Archaeologists mentioned by David Harrison describe wooden piles driven deep into the riverbed beneath the piers. Over centuries, water eroded them and weakened everything above, without people realizing. Peter Ackroyd notes that travelers sometimes preferred boats despite the danger under the arches. They believed the crowd on the bridge was worse than the current below. Several chronicles preserved in medieval collections speak of festivals and markets that filled every inch of space. Joy and risk lived side by side while the river watched in silence. Legal registers cited by historians contain testimonies about men who vanished after nightfall near the stalls. The court records end abruptly because there was no body and no witness. Patricia Pierce describes how carpenters patched holes and cracks with whatever material they could find. These temporary fixes created the illusion of safety while problems continued to grow. In several chapters of London Bridge, the biography, Peter Ackroyd explains how the bridge became like a living city above the river. He describes shopkeepers paying fees while worrying that the structure beneath them might one day collapse. David Harrison writes that during maintenance, workers sometimes discovered human remains trapped near the piers. These discoveries strengthened the belief that the bridge truly swallowed people. Ralph Flinley mentions medieval priests recording prayers for travelers who never returned. The fact that names were written without explanations helped the legend grow deeper. In Patricia Pierce's exploration of the old bridge, she notes how winter storms often swept goods and even animals into the river. People watched helplessly from the walkway as the current carried everything away. John Richardson's Annals of London lists the year 1561, when parts of the bridge were badly damaged by fire. Rebuilding took years, and the fear of crossing increased during that long, uncertain time. Peter Ackroyd describes the heads displayed at the southern gate as a grim warning from the authorities. Travelers passed beneath those silent faces while listening to the roar of the Thames below. H. M. Colvin writes about disputes between royal engineers and city officials about how to repair the arches. Delays left sections weak and unsafe, while politics continued above the water. Jerry White explains that during times of famine and economic hardship, the bridge became crowded with desperate sellers. More bodies meant more accidents and more stories of people disappearing in the crush. In archaeological surveys quoted by David Harrison, bits of pottery, nails, and tools were found embedded in the mud. These tiny objects show how everyday life constantly spilled into the river. Patricia Pierce describes reports of boats capsizing when the tide suddenly changed direction under the arches. Survivors said it felt as if the river itself grabbed them. Newspaper collections from the early 1900s retold older disasters with dramatic language. Each retelling pulled the legend further from ordinary explanation and deeper into fear. Peter Ackroyd also notes that poets and writers used the bridge as a symbol of death and passage. Literature then reinforced the belief that the bridge itself had a dark appetite. Legal records cited by historians show compensation claims from families who lost relatives near the bridge. Many claims failed because no one could prove exactly how the accidents happened. In later chapters discussed by David Harrison, there are references to constant repairs funded by special bridge taxes. Citizens paid because they feared what would happen if the structure failed completely. Peter Ackroyd explains that these taxes sometimes caused anger among traders, yet everyone still crossed the bridge each day because there was no safer alternative. Ralph Flinley mentions medieval sermons warning people to behave morally when crossing the bridge. Priests believed disasters came as punishment, when crowds forgot humility. Patricia Pierce found drawings showing houses leaning dangerously outward over the river. People stored goods in upper rooms, adding extra weight where the walls were already weak. John Richardson records that after storms, city workers dragged debris from under the arches for days. Among broken timbers, they sometimes found items that had clearly belonged to missing people. H.M. Colvin describes engineers designing temporary scaffolding that creaked and swayed over the water. Laborers risked their lives each time they climbed out to hammer loose stones back into place. Jerry White writes that children often worked as messengers running between shops on the bridge. Their small steps moved through chaos, where a sudden shove could erase them without trace. Peter Ackroyd notes one account of a cart horse slipping on wet stone and pulling its driver into the river with it. The story spread through the city and became another piece of the legend. In archaeological comments quoted by David Harrison, fragments of leather shoes were found buried near the piers. They might have belonged to travelers who never finished their journey. Patricia Pierce shows how some shopkeepers secretly reinforced floors with extra beams. They trusted their own woodwork more than the aging stone beneath them. Newspaper historians found letters from readers asking whether the old tales of disappearance were true. Editors answered cautiously because facts and stories had become impossible to separate. Peter Ackroyd writes that even when the new 19th century bridge opened, people still carried fear in their memories. The name London Bridge itself felt heavier than the stones. David Harrison concludes that the legend survived because every century added real suffering to an already dark story, and the river kept flowing, hiding more than it ever revealed. In the later studies reviewed by modern historians, the financial records of the bridge revealed endless lists of repairs. Every line spoke silently of cracks, broken stones, and danger that never rested. Peter Ackroyd explains that the bridge ward functioned like a small government managing tenants, rents, guards, and builders all at once. This constant administration shows how complicated life above the river truly was. David Harrison notes that some of the bridge keepers wrote about sleepless nights during storms. They feared that one strong winter would finally tear the structure apart. Ralph Flinley mentions medieval chronicles describing prayers said during especially violent tides. People gathered at the chapel and asked for protection before they dared to cross. Patricia Pierce records drawings of crowds watching boats shoot the bridge during festival times. What looked like entertainment was in truth a deadly risk that sometimes ended in silence and grief. In the Annals of London, John Richardson lists years when parts of the parapet collapsed during traffic. Those sudden breaks caused people to fall with carts and goods directly into the river. H.M. Colvin writes about engineers arguing whether the arches should be widened. Some believed it would calm the river while others feared it would weaken the entire foundation. Jerry White shows how poverty around London pushed many families to live dangerously close to the edge of survival. The bridge became both opportunity and threat at the same time. Peter Ackroyd describes how travelers arriving from the countryside were shocked by the noise and closeness of the bridge. They felt trapped between buildings while the water roared beneath them, unseen. David Harrison points out that when the decision was finally made to replace the old bridge, many Londoners felt both relief and sadness. They were losing a piece of history even though it had caused so much fear. Archaeologists studying the remains found layers of construction, one on top of another. Each layer told of repairs, disasters, and human attempts to control the unpredictable river. Patricia Pierce writes that even after dismantling the medieval bridge, stories about disappearances continued to be told for decades. Memory is slower than demolition, and legends outlive stone. In later retellings gathered by historians, the bridge became almost a character in the story of London itself. It stood for danger, survival, ambition, and the quiet price paid by ordinary people. When we imagine the people who crossed London Bridge, we begin to feel the story becomes human again. Each person carried hopes, worries, and secrets across the stones while the river listened. Some crossed to sell bread, some to pay debts, some to visit loved ones, and some to escape poverty and begin again. The bridge became a path of dreams as well as danger. Peter Ackroyd reminds us that the bridge witnessed coronations, funerals, riots, and celebrations. Kings rode over it while beggars slept beneath the same arches. David Harrison writes that time on the bridge seemed different from anywhere else in the city. The sound of the water slowed thoughts and made people aware of how fragile they were. At dawn, traders opened shutters and the first carts rattled across the stones. The mist over the river glowed faintly while church bells echoed through the air. By midday, the noise grew into a living storm of voices, animals, and rushing footsteps. The bridge breathed like a busy market stretching above the current. At night, everything changed, and the same path became shadowed and uncertain. Torches flickered, and the wind carried the smell of wet stone and distant smoke. Travelers pressed their cloaks tighter and listened carefully for footsteps behind them. The idea that someone could vanish here felt suddenly believable. In Jerry White's descriptions of London life, the bridge appears as a place where the city revealed its true heart. Wealth and hunger stood side by side without a wall between them. Patricia Pierce adds scenes of children watching the water with wide eyes. To them the river looked endless and full of secrets no adult could fully explain. Over centuries, every whisper, every tragedy, every rumor settled like dust on the legend. The story grew not because of one event, but because of thousands of moments layered together. When the old medieval bridge finally disappeared, people still felt as if a memory had been cut from the city. The river seemed strangely open and empty without its heavy arching spine. Yet the legend remained, carried by books, maps, and stories passed quietly across dinner tables. London Bridge no longer stood as it once had, but its shadow stayed. Modern visitors walk across the new bridge and feel nothing at first. But if they stop and lean over the rail and watch the water, something older begins to stir in the imagination. They might remember lines from Peter Ackroyd, or records gathered by John Richardson, or the stories retold by David Harrison. Suddenly, the river feels deeper than before. They realize they are standing above centuries of footsteps, above laughter, fear, trade, prayer, crime, hope, and loss drifting together like currents. And they understand why people once said the bridge ate those who crossed it, not because it was alive, but because it stood at the place where danger and life were always touching. Every city has such a place where history becomes almost a voice. In London, that voice rises softly from the Thames beneath the name London Bridge. It is not a monster. It is a memory of how cities grow, how people struggle, and how water keeps every secret it is given. Historians say that to understand a city, you must walk where its people once walked. On London Bridge, the stones once carried more stories than any book could hold. If you listen carefully through the rhythm of the river, you can almost hear those stories returning. They come back like distant voices carried on mist. One voice belongs to a merchant counting his coins and worrying about thieves hidden in the shadows. Another belongs to a mother guiding her child carefully away from the edge. Another belongs to a sailor staring at the arches and wondering if his boat will survive the passage. And another belongs to a guard who has seen too many accidents to ever cross without fear. Peter Ackroyd describes how the bridge shaped the imagination of Londoners for centuries. It stood as a reminder that progress always comes with a price. David Harrison shows us that every repair only delayed the next disaster. The bridge demanded attention again and again, like a restless patient. In the documents preserved by the city clerk, we see lists of names tied to tragedies. Not legends, but real people whose lives ended somewhere between the stones and the river. Their absence became part of the city's memory, and memory slowly turned into story. Story then turned into legend. Patricia Pierce writes that children growing up near the bridge learned early to respect the river. They were told never to play too close, never to lean too far, never to trust calm water. Ralph Flinley reminds us that medieval life accepted danger as something ordinary. People did not expect safety, they expected survival. When modern engineers look back, they see mistakes in design and overcrowding, but they also see remarkable determination from those who tried to keep the bridge standing. Workers climbed out over the water in winter winds while the river roared beneath them. Their hands shook from cold and fear, yet they repaired what they could. Archaeologists today brush dirt from tiny fragments found near the old foundations. A buckle, a spoon, part of a shoe, each one a small echo of a life once lived above the river. Museums place these objects in glass so we can stand and stare and imagine. Suddenly the legend feels less like myth and more like memory returning to the surface. Writers and filmmakers continue to revisit the story because it offers something timeless. It speaks about the meeting point between human ambition and the unpredictable power of nature. And as long as the Thames continues to move under the bridges of London, the story will continue to live quietly. It waits in the sound of water, and the fog, and the night air, and the footsteps of anyone who crosses. And so, through history, fear, legend, and truth, we discovered that the bridge was never a monster, but a witness to centuries of danger, struggle, and human life. A place where stories were born, where people vanished, and where imagination grew stronger than reality. Now the river flows quietly, the stones are gone, but the memory remains. And now, what do you think? Was it truly a bridge that ate people? Or was it only a dangerous place shaped by crime, currents, and fear? Write your opinions in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and thank you so much for watching.